We all, without exception, have unconscious beliefs. Sometimes they're created by our own experiences in life, but these make up the minority of such beliefs. Almost all of our unconscious beliefs are drawn from the collective unconscious and form an integral part of our ego identities. When you watch a video like this one, your pre-existing unconscious beliefs may rise to the surface. This is the experience of being triggered. It happens to all of us. The only way to become free of these unconscious beliefs is to transmute them by challenging ourselves with concepts we find disagreeable. And then when the unconscious patterns threaten to take over, uncomfortable as it is to do so, we must remain present and listen intently to what is being said. We must override our subconscious reactions if we are to understand the other person's viewpoint. If you find yourself getting triggered by this video and feel that you cannot remain conscious of what is actually being said, please just stop watching. My intent is helping to heal the temporary divisions between men and women, a fact which will hopefully become clear if you can remain present and make it to the very end. Thank you for watching. The major premise of feminism is that women are disadvantaged in some way, specifically due to their being women, and that this perceived disadvantage must be redressed. You cannot possibly identify as a feminist unless you hold this belief or some permutation of it. I am not a feminist in the least. In my view, the concept that there exists inequality between the sexes is entirely mind-made. Note that I said mind-made and not man-made. We, women and men, are two sides of the same coin, two pieces of the same interlocking puzzle. It is simply not even a consideration for me that women and men are anything other than equal to each other. Equal does not mean the same, it means complementary. This is natural. I would wager that almost all of us are familiar with the word misogyny and know its meaning, a dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women. How many of us know the word for harbouring these same feelings against men, however? It is misandry. Do you find it strange that one of these words is so well known and widely heard in society, and the other is largely unknown? It is important to remember that words are only signposts pointing to concepts, but they are also helpful in providing the nucleus around which our individual understanding of concepts can grow. Once you know the right word, you have something to work with, and you now experience increased awareness of that thing whenever it crops up. I recall that I learned the word misogynist from a James Bond film. MI6 agent M, played by Judi Dench, used it to insult her colleague, and I had to pause the film to look it up. I logged it in the memory banks as a curiosity more than anything else, but I now had the vocabulary around which the concept of misogyny could grow. Thanks to the balanced relationship my parents always seemed to have had, it was rather alien to me, the idea that men might be oppressing women somehow. At some point in the future I returned to the concept, and through my own curious exploration of the topic, learned of the related concept, misandry. The thing to know is that the very same force which seeks to oppress women simply because of what they are, has exactly the same intent towards men. Why would it be any different? Why oppress women and not men? The misconception of feminism is that it is ultimately men who are doing the oppressing. But I believe that if you take a step back and really look at what's going on before our very eyes, men are just as oppressed for their being men as women are for their being women. What I would agree to is that weak men are doing the oppressing of all others, men and women. They are doing this, often unknowingly, on behalf of something else entirely. Indeed, the force doing the oppressing is ultimately neither male nor female. It is not man or woman. It is not human. This realization changes everything. Let's look at some facts. Ultimately, women and men come from nature, at least our bodies do, and in nature there is always balance, equality. Remember that equality does not mean the same, it means complementary. Man's lust for woman is equal to her sex. It is also just as sacred as her sex. I did not learn this until I was almost 30. Every time I watched porn or masturbated, Every time I had sex with a woman with whom I did not share an emotional connection, I was unknowingly profaning the temple which is my body. There is not enough time here to get into the ill effects of pornography, which is almost entirely aimed at the destruction of the masculinity of its largely male audience. I reserve my sexual desire for one woman now, and it is completely sacred. I am still human, I do still see erotic images sometimes, as they are everywhere in society, but seeing them now is tinged with the knowledge that this draws my energy away from the one for whom it is reserved. It weakens me, and it weakens my bond with my lover. We all know that women have something sacred, and if circumstance has been particularly unkind to her, a woman can sell that sacred thing to get by. Her sex can become her currency. Prostitution is sometimes called the oldest profession in the world, and even certain species of animal use it to gain currency of whatever form among their social groups. Just as a woman can be exploited, or indeed will allow herself to be exploited because of her sex, so can a man be exploited, or indeed will allow himself to be exploited because of his. There is a parallel between a woman prostituting herself and a man paying for her services. If you think all he loses in the deal is some money, you have fallen victim to the programming of Western society. In the West, we are not taught the esoteric importance of the male seed. Learn about that as I did, and you may change your thinking. It changed my attitudes towards women, pornography, and sex forever. Let's examine the claim that women are oppressed in society and men are not. Who makes up the majority of the prison population? Who fights and dies completely needlessly in the wars? Who does the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs? Who is more likely to lose the right to see their children in custody battles? Who gets left behind by the education system? Who sleeps on the street when all else fails? Who are driven to suicide in the greatest numbers? Don't get me wrong, I'm not coming from a place of equally misplaced masculism to point these things out. These are simply dispassionate observations. To suggest that all these facts are so, simply because we are men, is as simplistic as the statistic which says women get paid less than men because they are women. I concede that men are more likely to commit the type of aggravated and violent crime that will see them locked up. But I also see how, due to their relative vulnerability, the court system seeks where possible punishments other than incarceration for women. I concede that the military does not even allow women in most of its frontline combat roles due to the psychology of warfare and the problems that arise from having mixed-sex combat units. I concede that of course a homeless woman is at a greater risk of being assaulted than a man in the same situation, and so they are more likely to be provided with sheltered accommodation. I concede that women are allowed to work on fishing boats, they're allowed to be miners or construction workers or road workers, but overwhelmingly they do not choose these roles. The dirtiest, most physically difficult and dangerous jobs in society have historically always been done by men. This is the way that men sell their bodies to get by, and this is, statistically speaking, why women outlive men by at least 4 years on average. What I hope to demonstrate by pointing these things out is how men are just as equally oppressed as women, albeit in a very different fashion. Different, yet equal. Let's look at the claim that the patriarchal society we live under, and I do agree there is a case to be made that that is what it is, was built by men for their own advantage and for the advantage of all men at the expense of women. The first thing to consider is this. Do you look at a president or prime minister, the head of a multinational corporation, the managing director of a company, a pope, any man really who is at the top of the tree in his chosen field, and see someone who is necessarily strong, centered, mature, and operating from a place of balanced and discerning composure? Or do you perhaps see a ruthless tyrant, a cowardly bully, or a silver-tongued manipulator? Of course, we all possess a higher and lower nature. We all have the capacity for positively and negatively driven actions. Western society runs on our lower nature and has been constructed in such a fashion to the detriment of all humans. A man operating more from his lower nature finds it easier to get ahead in certain endeavours. This is why we find fields such as politics, business, news media, education, banking and law dominated by men. I'm not saying that an evil man will necessarily do well and a good man will fail, not at all. I am merely saying that it is less a case of a premeditated plot by an organisation of misogynists to dominate society, and more so a process of aggregation lasting tens of thousands of years throughout human civilization. Scum will always rise to the top of a scummy system. So, am I saying that men have a greater capacity for scummy behaviour? Not exactly. Women can exploit their own lower nature just as much as men and will do so just as unconsciously. Think of a woman using her femininity to lure and manipulate a weaker man. While this technique may not be useful in getting her to the top of the corporate ladder, it certainly gives her power in other ways. The fact remains that there are so many human beings with egos dependent on their being the underdog to explain their position in society, or their lack of success by whatever metric they choose to define that success or lack thereof. Let me be the first to put up my hand and say that I created the conditions in my body which allowed an autoimmune condition to manifest, and for 5 years this has been a big part of how I define myself. Health is my metric. I am that guy who has worked so hard on his health with conventional and unconventional approaches, but is still sick. Until I'm able to sustain a level of consciousness where I no longer need to be sick to make sense of my life situation, I will be ill. A true feminist is an underdog. She has to be, for if she knew the truth, that she was equal to all other women and to all men, she would by definition cease to be a feminist. The perceived problems she faces in the arena of gender relations would vanish, they would literally melt away. That is the power of even a slight rise in consciousness. First, we must be willing to see the barriers for what they are, and then we must be willing to put down the baggage which prevents us from surmounting them. Divide and rule is the oldest trick in the book. Forget race, religion, nationalism, politics. The most complete division that can be made of any population is men against women, women against men. Gender is the most subversive and all-pervasive division there can be. The very fact that its effects are almost entirely unconscious is what makes it so effective. A cursory examination of the currently mushrooming debate about gender inequality, which almost always seems to boil down to perceived pay gaps, reveals that most feminists are in fact coming from a place of deep unconsciousness. A collective belief that they, or even previous generations or women in other cultures, have been or are being systematically oppressed by men because of their gender, and that the only way to right this wrong is to fight. This is a perpetual struggle which helps feed the very system which is oppressing us all. I wish I had something more constructive to say in closing, but I do not. It is after all very easy to see where we think others are going wrong. As I've already admitted in this video and others, I currently lack the required level of consciousness to surmount even my own relatively insignificant barriers to balance and healing. What I can say is that protracted hardship and suffering is known for breeding the very qualities which help humans to overcome these predicaments. Going through suffering is how we raise our consciousness, and that is how ultimately we will prevail over illness, discrimination, misunderstanding, ignorance, all things. My girlfriend is a self-acknowledged feminist, and I see her as the most beautiful expression of womanhood in all her imperfection. I see that even in this brilliant and intelligent woman there is unconsciousness. How could it be otherwise for her to identify as an underdog and a feminist? All I can do is offer my unconditional love to her in the knowledge that love alone is what will heal these collective wounds by raising our shared level of consciousness. Love is the state of absolute oneness with something. There can be no division, no conflict, perceived or otherwise. When a man and a woman are united in love, that which is neither man nor woman, our common foe, will shrink in fear at our approach.